had somebody with prompts.
Yeah, some grain, it's still up. on the
Yeah,
hill.
great.
That's right.
So we've already got precedent.
We've set the precedent.
Are we live?
We are live.
All right. You want me to go?
Yeah, so H457, take it away.
Is Jed coming?
He will be joining us, I think.
He's at the kids thing.
Oh, right, yeah. Alrighty, for the record, John O'Brien, Representative John O'Brien, Windsor Orange One, which is Royalton and Tunbridge. I am introducing H457. I thought I would tell you the story of how this bill came about first. I went to Representative Graham's district, Williamstown, and there's a Dollar General in Williamstown, and I went in partly because Royalton is thinking of putting in a Dollar General. It's very controversial, and plus, being on the dairy task force, I'm always interested in what's for sale in something like Dollar General. So I went in, I bought some milk and some half and half, and it was there was no local milk in the cooler. It was this thing called Clover Valley, which I'd never heard of. But the good thing is, having served on the dairy task force, I learned from the other more experienced members there that there's a code on pretty much every bit of all milk, and I think half and half. I'm not sure what other dairy products. So you can find out the state where it came from and the plant if you want. So, like Vermont is 50. If you ever look at Booth Brothers, it'll say 50 dash something. So I said, where's this from? And it turns out the whole milk, which was for sale for this $2.85 a half gallon, was from Pennsylvania. It's what's this, 42, I think. And 42, yeah. So this came from Pennsylvania, and the half and half, also Clover Valley, which I think is a sort of New Jersey-based dairy company, was from Minnesota.
Wow.
Yeah, from 27.
Minnesota.
So what appalled me to some extent was that about 5 miles away in Southbury, is it Southbury around near Berlin, is the Hood Booth Brothers fluid milk processing plant. And there was no milk from there for sale at Dollar General. Across the street at a gas station store, it's a little market called Pump and Pantry. They sell Booth Brothers, and it's independent. It's not a chain, right? So that got me thinking about policy on, especially milk, but other things too, as far as what can we do to de-incentivize this sort of national one-size-fits-all food policy that companies like Dollar General have. And so one, how can we incentivize local agriculture? And the second thing is, how can we recognize that there's that transportation has costs besides just transportation, right? There's a carbon footprint involved, which is not good for the planet. So I thought, well, working with Mike, is there a way to do this with a tax? And you run into all sorts of interstate commerce problems. But what I thought we might be able to do is, if we could tax raw agricultural products from where they're essentially processed, and then tax them sort of by mileage to where they get to a retailer's shelf. Because what I was thinking is, this is probably a few cents cheaper than Booth Brothers, maybe because of scale. I don't know what they do and where they're sort of, maybe it's by scale, maybe it's by, either size of farms or they're just doing big national sales to Dollar General. But is there a way where, if this was actually a little bit more, not hugely, but a little bit more expensive than Booth Brothers, would local customers buy Booth Brothers more, or would Dollar General say, hey, let's get our dairy source from a local company and thus local farms? So Thinking, I think we were up against the deadline, and it's also a very complicated subject. Like I'm saying, he doesn't know of any other bills like this we can kind of copy. So we made it a short form bill, and I would love to work with this committee, sort of introduce it now and over the summer, work on who might be witnesses, who would be stakeholders for this kind of thing. Answer the 100 questions around this because it's a revenue bill. It's also just there's a lot to work through with how would this work? Would it be a tax that consumers pay? And so people say it's regressive. It's making food more expensive. I had people call me up and say, oh, great, my bananas from Hawaii are going to cost a lot more. So, but what I mostly wanted to do was use raw agricultural products or nearly raw that we have access to here, that we grow here, and make that the focus of this. So just like the milk, instead of driving something like an apple across the country from Washington, let's at least say, okay, the apple from Middlebury or Shoreham or whatever, we'll tax that, but it's only going 50 miles to a retail store, whereas the one from Washington State has to pay the whole way. And maybe that would change the balance so that Honors would buy a lot more Vermont apples. And it would fit in with New England, feeds New England too, ultimately. But then there are all these questions of like what products, like once you get into like a blueberry muffin, it doesn't really work. And if it's something we don't grow, obviously bananas or pineapples, whatever, it doesn't really work. And some things are seasonal, like right now, strawberries, would we tax them because we don't have strawberries now, but Plant City, Florida is sending all theirs up here. There's things like terroir, like some people might push back and say, well, our strawberries are a lot better because they're growing in this special soil. So we'd have to work through all that. And then also with this committee, think about unintended consequences, whether another state might say, oh, we're going to tax your maple syrup because, in Ohio we make maple syrup, but we want to encourage maple sugars in Ohio at the expense of Vermont maple sugars. So that was the bill. There's, certain things like placeholders, like the tax of 0.001 cent a mile. I think I figured that on just making this slightly more expensive than Booth Brothers, but it could really be anything. I've never done a tax bill, so I don't really know how that works, but it could be an interesting source of revenue, which we could turn around for any of our, our projects like H205. So that's the bill. It's got a long ways to go.
I'm just curious, so this will only apply to imports? Like would we only be taxing things that are coming into the state for sale or?
So it's taxing all agricultural commodities by distance. So
the sale of, Vermont being an export market for certain things, commodity, generally agricultural products, milk or maple syrup, it would apply to everything, even if it would just be
Vermont, right? So like maple syrup, if it comes from Cabot, to a retailer pays, half a penny or something. If it came from Canada, it would pay,
But if it went my question is if it goes the other way, if you sell maple syrup to California,
no,
it wouldn't, okay.
No.
I think I'm understanding what Henry's asking. So if living in Grand Isle, am I then going to pay more for things that I'm getting from Southern Vermont?
By the penny, perhaps.
This seems like a lot to keep track of. Because some of my food comes from Cisco, from my local store. Some of my food comes from Black River Produce. So at what point is the tax, who's going to apply the tax, who's going to figure the distance, and how are we going to collect it?
Well, potentially, we talked about this, like how far upstream you might go, whether it would be like an excise tax or sort of at the cash register tax.
Right.
And how far back to, is it the field where it's grown? Is it the processing plant where it's like milk, where it's actually put together? I was thinking this morning, Vermont fluid milk here that goes to, say, a hood plant in Massachusetts and then comes back to our retail stores, right? How do
Right.
you tax that? But, I think we could talk about this and see if there's a way to work through this. In general, the way to get around the interstate commerce seemed to be you have to be fair to everybody. And so that's where, if it's just,
It seems unfair to me though to tax, people in different parts of Vermont who don't live next to where things are grown, but we're still buying Vermont products. So unless it's grown like on Grand Isle, I'm still going to pay a tax for it.
right, you'd have to pay 2 pennies more if it came from Bennington,
Whereas if it were from California, it'd be $3 more.
right?
Right.
That's the way to get around, we're taxing it by the mile. Otherwise, if you just said, oh, we're gonna tax food from California, I think you run, and I can talk about this, but you run into major interstate because you're not being fair to.
It just seems a little
states.
unfair to tax Vermont food when we're trying to tell everyone to, eat local and now we're saying, oh, by the way, you're going to pay a little
Well,
more.
I think you have to tax it, but because it's
Right.
such a small amount and you're so close, if you eat food from Milton, right, and it's,
No, I know. No, just kidding.
it's, a quarter of a cent or something.
Rodney and then Dave.
So if Cabot was sending cheese to California, will that be taxed?
No. It's only Vermont, it's the Vermont markets.
So if I buy cheese from France,
But, so,
Potentially cheese, we'd have to figure out if that's, right, if that's on our list.
got it.
Or if it's international, right? So if we're buying strawberries from Chile, then,
What about wine?
yeah, possibly.
Sorry, I'm sorry.
Beer might be one that would work really well because,
finish my question.
Sorry.
Poor guy.
You were taking a maple product, value-added product, from Williamstown to Waterbury, will that be taxed?
if that was included in the raw agricultural products, it would be.
Maple is agricultural product.
So if it was maybe maple syrup, it might be, but at some point, if it's the special gram recipe, then we might not tax it. I think like the Agency of Ag could come up or the Department of Taxes with the list of what sort of works here. So things like beer, I was thinking this morning, we have great beer made in Vermont, not necessarily Vermont products, but if Budweiser and Coors had to pay extra to get on the shelves here, it would help incentivize our local beer market.
David.
So I'm just thinking that, remembering our statistics from earlier testimony, 16% of the food consumed in Vermont is from Vermont. So this would be the other 80, this would all apply basically in larger quantities to that remaining 84%. I would imagine that a big portion of that 84% comes from California and or South America, Mexico for, seasonal reasons. That could impact negatively people struggling to put food on the table. So I would imagine this bill would need to have some countermeasure to that, meaning that part of the money collected would need to go towards food shelves or discounting local food or some other mechanism to make it easier for people struggling to buy food.
Right, so potentially the revenue could go
Right.
to something like that.
Right. That's what I'm thinking. Yeah.
And I think what you were saying, I'm not sure what the sustainable jobs, who is it? It's Ellen's group or Farm to Plate, right?
To play, yeah.
That might be all food. I'm not sure, because this is really focusing on agricultural commodities or products that we have available here,
Right.
but that Dollar General say, we don't care. We're reporting our national contracted food. So and things like Cheez-Its, right? We don't make Cheez-Its in Vermont, so it's not going to be taxed.
Cheez-Its.
Cheez-Its.
Okay.
Esme?
I liked when you said that, when we were talking about beer, you said Budweiser or Coors would have to cover the costs. And that is much more appealing to me, even if they do try to pass those costs down to the customer, we give them the opportunity. If you want to sell in Vermont, you have to pay this tax basically, but, so they could or could not pass that down onto the customer, and then the customer could choose maybe if it's enough to push them away from purchasing that particular product, basically. But starting with the actual company versus starting with the consumer.
Yeah, so Mike would probably know better about how, when you go from like a tax at the cash register upstream to the Budweisers of the world and how you would tax them.
Thank you, Representative O'Brien. Did you say that only products that Vermont also produces would be subject to the tax?
I think that's the place to start
Yeah.
because it fits better, like somebody, it's otherwise, while I agree that we should recognize transportation is bad, or it has a cost, I think to do it to all foods, right, is a super regressive tax essentially on all Vermont consumers. But if we did it as combined with to incentivize local farming by saying, look, we have great carrots that you grow, and if all of a sudden those carrots were cheaper than carrots from California or about the same price, people would be like, I like the Vermont carrots better.
I completely agree with you. I think my only pause is thinking that would likely apply to foods that are the most nutritionally dense. And I'm thinking of it in the terms of how we incentivize folks to reach for those more so than the things that aren't going to be taxed more, that are likely just really brutal on people's healths too, and create those perpetuating systems.
So like what?
Cheez-Its.
But we're not doing Cheez-Its because we don't have those.
But maybe you
But
should.
that's the problem in my
Yeah.
mind is that we're not taxing that additionally. So when we're incentivizing it in terms of nutrition and value, we're putting a higher tax on the things that we want people to be eating. We're taxing the periphery of the grocery store
Right.
instead of the internal. And to me, that's the moral struggle that I have. But yes.
No, I totally agree with you as far as, but it's not a nutrition bill. It's a incentivize flag and make transportation pay its true cost.
David, then Josie?
So why are we not doing packaged food with this? What's the reasoning? Like, why aren't we doing the Cheez-Its? I didn't really understand the reasoning why we would not also apply this to that and just Whole Foods.
I think because no one's done this, and so to sell it, I think you need that local connection.
Right.
And if we just start taxing all food from everywhere,
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah.
I think it's hard on the consumers.
Yeah.
So there'd be major pushback there.
Yeah.
And it's just more complicated to track as far as, did those Cheez-Its come from Michigan or did they come from New Jersey?
Right.
And there are all those different ingredients in it.
Yeah, they may not even need to disclose some of this information.
Yeah.
Like you have to with milk.
Right.
Right.
Josie, then Mike?
I just want to build on what Heather just said. This is going to make food procurement for food shelves more expensive. Because sometimes they get carrots from Pennsylvania, sometimes, and it's what the food bank gets. And that, again, sort of seems a little counterintuitive.
So maybe the revenues could subsidize that.
Yeah, it's just, it depends on where the food bank gets it and, or sometimes where Hannaford gets it because you get their cast-offs that are about to go bad. What about meat?
Or that could be an exemption. If it's going to a not-for-profit, maybe there's no tax.
Okay, that could work.
And you were saying, what about meat?
I was just wondering, what about meat? I just had this flash of different proteins and sometimes what the food shelf will get, rack of ribs from Pennsylvania. But you just answered that because you'd make it exempt because they're not for profit.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mike, and then Rodney?
I was just wondering if you've thought through sort of how you determine what is grown here. Like we just came from a farm that grows burdock root, but that's not a common crop grown in Vermont.
Yeah.
So have you given thought to sort of how that plays out?
Yeah, I think you probably have to do an inventory of what crops we grow and when they're available in the stores.
Okay, so also there would be some sort of seasonal component.
Exactly. I think there'd have to be, right.
So Dollar General and Walmart, some of these other chain stores. Person doing the ordering for products not in Vermont. They're in the headquarters, which Dollar General's in charge of. So obviously they put out bids, RFPs.
Yeah.
So it would seem to me that they've already figured out it's cheaper to truck milk from Minnesota to Vermont than to purchase it in Vermont. So it's 1 cent, would it be enough to change that?
Right, well, it's just a estimate, I thought, let's start with something. Right, we could double it or,
It's a
whatever.
placeholder.
Right, exactly. And I think,
Some people go buy milk at Dollar General because they can't afford to go to the pantry and buy it.
right,
That would stop people from drinking milk and then we're gonna have more milk surplus.
right.
Price for farmers.
Those are those unintended consequences that we need to investigate, I think. But it's, just looking at what it costs, I think it's pennies cheaper right now. It's not like, oh, it's half the price at Walmart or Dollar General. It's close. So I think if we could just shift it to the other way, if it was 30 cents more, and then potentially, right, there was some sort of return to people who, needed it to buy milk, then, all of a sudden they're thinking, oh, I'll buy Booth Brothers instead.
It's not regressive anymore at that point.
Yeah. And I also was thinking that this whole sort of idea that whoever makes the cheapest product, good for them. They figured out how to do this, but that's sort of like saying, that freedom of speech though has limits as far as, right, if we use, for food, if slave labor is used, and it's cheaper, that we would all say, well, that's not really fair, or we're going to kill all the orangutans in the world to give you guys a little bit cheaper food, or we're going to use pesticides that are banned in the US to grow, cheaper food. Like, there are limits on that sort of capitalist, who can make the cheapest food.
So Esme and then Charles.
I don't know exactly logistically if this would be possible, but to your point, Rodney, about how, in Walmart or Dollar General, people are not thinking from state to state. They're thinking about just the general, what they're going to purchase for the store because it's a chain. Like, if we could somehow take advantage of that, and they're going to order what they're going to order, and it's not going to make a difference whether or not we have a tax, but that tax, to bring that product to Vermont has to be collected basically. So they wouldn't change their habits necessarily right away, but we would collect income. That's perhaps wishful thinking, but I had a vision after you said that.
Charles?
I know I'm in a minority, but I just have to think that you have a good idea, but I think the bureaucracy alone will be astronomical passed on to taxpayers. I'm not against anything. It's just I don't understand how, beings that Vermont's already way overtaxed and it's going to get worse, the bureaucracy alone is going to, I don't know how you pay for it.
Right. That's I think a good question on it. But, I thought the same thing about taxes on the cloud or on, things we buy on Amazon, and they seem to have figured it out, and it's a great revenue stream for Vermont. So I think it's worth looking into and seeing if you get to that point where you're just like, oh, this is way too bureaucratic, top heavy. Let's not do it. I'm okay with that.
Dave, did you have another?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment. Yeah, it would definitely need to be a mechanized taxation system, computer algorithms and the whole 9 yards. I don't think this is a boots on the ground thing. This is definitely information technology having to be implemented to keep track of this. But I'm sure it could be done.
Right. Just the way SKUs, tell a certain amount of information about something.
I'm wondering if, maybe we should have Mike come up to the chair. And before that, John, did you tell us what the price was across the street for the Booth Brothers?
I have to go. I haven't been there for a while, so I should go again. Because if I get there, then I have to take really bad dirt roads to Tunbridge. I haven't been there. But I can find out. It'd be interesting, yeah.
I just had a question.
It's $4 or something.
For a half gallon?
Gallon.
A gallon, yeah. I think it's really close.
Minnesota.
It's from your home state.
Between Hannaford's, Shaw's, Price Chopper, the cheapest place to buy Booth Brothers milk is Dump Pantry.
Right. You often see that, yeah, where they do high volume. Yeah.
$4.39 for Booth Brothers.
A half gallon,
Yeah, what's on Instacart?
And how much was this?
$2.85.
So with the $3 California tax, it would be $1 more than the Vermont product.
Well, if it's coming from Minnesota or Pennsylvania, right? So say
Yeah, not that much.
400 miles. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
That,
lots to think about.
Lesson on interstate commerce.
She's here. This is Mike O'Grady with Legislative Council. I'm sorry, I was scheduled today on this post, so I don't have all my full notes that I would normally bring on a walkthrough. But I think you just experienced the dynamic of a short form bill. Short form bills are often introduced when there are subjects that are complex, that have many facets, and the sponsor just wants to introduce the idea and then explore that idea with the committee that's willing. I think you just experienced like the beginning of a short form bill. And there are questions here, legal and practical. I don't think any of them are insurmountable, but there are issues. And I'm going to start talking about one of those legal issues because I think it informs how the statement of purpose for the bill is drafted. So the Commerce Clause gives the U.S. Congress the ability to regulate commerce between the states. And there's what's called the negative or the dormant aspect of that says that states themselves can regulate commerce, but not in a way that's discriminatory against other states or businesses in other states. So you have to draft your laws that apply to commerce in a way that is non-discriminatory. So it can't just be a tax on imported food, because that would be a tax, that would be discriminatory. It would give a benefit to Vermont food producers versus out-of-state food producers. One of the other things it has to be is it can't be for an economic protectionist intent. So even if it isn't on its face discriminatory against out-of-state interest, it can't be intended solely for the purpose of economic protectionism. So that's two things. It can't be explicitly discriminatory. It can't be economic protectionist. It also cannot discriminate in effect against out-of-state commerce, which is a question that relates to the 8416 of where food comes from. I also think you can't do it in a way that is seasonal, because that would have a discriminatory effect too, because the seasons in other places are so different that you'd have a variation in taxation that would be very difficult to justify and to implement. Plus, the way that the bill is drafted, you have to figure out the mileage, where it came from when it was packed. So that means that you have to compel the manufacturer, the producer, or the transporter to tell you where it came from. And that's a First Amendment issue. It's a commercial speech issue. I think you've just addressed a lot of commercial speech issues in here with your right to repair bill. But this is actually a little bit easier because there's been some U.S. Supreme Court cases around what's called COOL, country of origin labeling, and where food producers argued that compelling them to say where a food came from was a violation of their First Amendment rights. And the courts have said, no, it's not, because it is a commercial speech. It's about something that is non-contentious and is factual, just where it is from. It's not like you're saying you have to disclose whether or not you provide abortion services and what abortion services you provide in order to sell a product, and that has been found to be controversial. And so you don't get a lower level of speech if it's factual and non-controversial. I think that compelling of where did it come from is going to be within the bounds of the First Amendment. And then you have state law related to the assessment of taxes. It's a very low standard. It just basically needs to be rationally based, but it has to be equitably apportioned. So you can't assess that imported food at a different rate than the food that originates in Vermont. So using and the example of that, it's an actual case that happened in Burlington. They were assessing water rates, and for the rate, they were assessing one rate for a size house that was just say 30 by 30, and a second much higher rate for the same 30 by 30 house that had 2 people in it, but it wasn't based on usage. It was just based on the fact that there were 2 residential units in it. So it's not a same size house, same size theoretical use, but they assigned a different higher rate for the same size building. And the court said that was not equitably apportioned. So you have to equitably apportion that tax under Vermont law. And I think you do that in the way that this is described, summarized in the statement of purpose. Are there questions? Yes. How is it implemented? How is it implemented? I do think it probably shouldn't be a retail tax, because you are taking, you're basically will be multiplying the points of taxation and collection of information. I think it probably should be a wholesale tax. I do think you will run into the issue that several of you noted, that many of the chain businesses source regionally. Cisco, I can't remember who's referenced Cisco, but Cisco sources from basically the Delmarva Peninsula to Quebec and then out to Ohio. So that's their supply area. And so if they can get products that they can then transport throughout that region, they're going to look for the cheapest product in that region. Doesn't mean that they couldn't, without incentive, look to source differently in different parts of the country because it's worthwhile to them. And then with any Commerce Clause bill like this, whether it's requiring lamp manufacturers to label the lamp as containing mercury, or any food to be that's GMO produced to be labeled with GMO, or the right to repair, the manufacturer will have the discretion to not sell their product in the state. And that is one of the things that you should consider. And when you drafted, the General Assembly drafted the GMO labeling, there was a lot of threat about that. There wasn't a lot of products that were pulled off the shelf, but there were some that were pulled off the shelf when the state law went into effect. And the one that I acutely was aware of was Pirate Booty, you know, the little Robert's Pirate Booty, because of the way that they make that Pirate Booty. And my kids ate it every day. The way that they made Pirate Booty, they couldn't distinguish what was GMO corn and what was not GMO corn. And if they even could get enough GMO-free corn at that time to make that product the way that they were making it at that scale. So you have, those are all of the issues. You got a Commerce Clause issue, you got a First Amendment issue, you got an equitable apportionment of tax under state law. You have the practical issue of where and how to collect. And then you just have the practical concern about whether or not a manufacturer of food decides to continue to sell or if you can shift those regional food distributors to start selling different products based on this tax. Again, it's a big idea, and I appreciate the idea. I think it's doable, but it'll really depend on what you draft, because it's gonna have multiple facets. It's doable, but it's gonna be difficult.
Good fun.
That's kind of where I am. I don't want to say you can't do that. Honestly, I think you can do this, but it's something that you have a lot of questions to answer, like any short form book.
So questions for Mike, Dave?
So, regarding the non-discriminatory practices concerning commerce, I'm going to ask you to speculate, and I know that is kind of a wild shot, but is it not discriminatory to charge product a greater amount of tax based on the mileage, given that you go 3,000 miles? Well, I mean, that's California. You're basically discriminating, product from 3,000 miles away.
It's the unit of taxation that courts generally look at.
So per mile, consistent.
Right, and so you're like, it's the assessed dollar value of your home. That's how your tax rate is applied, or your income, that's how your tax rate is applied. Because people have different incomes, there's different tax rates. Here, you have a uniform rate. So assessing that rate to everyone at the same measure, same unit, it may have discriminatory effect, but it's not discriminatory on its face. So that's a part of the Commerce Clause analysis. You first look, does it regulate commerce? Yes, this regulates commerce. Does it regulate this commerce in a discriminatory, overt way? Like, it will literally say, like one of the big Commerce Clause cases, you can't import trash from New Jersey into Pennsylvania. Well, that was discriminatory on its face. Is it discriminatory in effect? Because of the nature of the regulation, will it discriminate more against out-of-state entities than it would in-state entities? And there is an argument there for that. I don't think it's a great argument, and I offer that because when mercury bulbs were first started to have to be labeled with the HG for the elemental sign for mercury, there were one or two light bulb manufacturers in Vermont, but not to the scale of the manufacturer of light bulbs around the world. And the court at that time said it's not discriminatory in effect. It applies to a Vermont lamp maker as much as it applies to a universal or international lamp maker. And if that universal lamp maker doesn't want to comply with the labeling requirements, then they don't have to sell in Vermont. Here, you have many more people that produce food that is sold in Vermont and will be subject to the same unit of taxation that the out-of-state producer will be charged. So you have a better argument that it's not discriminatory in effect when compared to, it's called Sorrell, NEMA versus Sorrell. So I think looking at it that way, you would argue it's not discriminatory. And let me be clear. There's going to be arguments.
Yeah.
People are going to come at you when you pursue this and say this is unconstitutional. You're going to have me or the AG or Abby who does taxation say no. We don't really know. We can't say no. It's never unconstitutional because no court has looked at this, right? And so we are just going to say these are the tests. we think you have a rational basis, that we don't think it's discriminatory, that's the kind of thing that we will need to do. And so when I drafted the GMO labeling with this committee, this House Ag Committee, one of the things that the committee and I did is we planned and we planned to create a record. We planned to set forth what the basis was. You take testimony on what your basis is, and how this will change consumer purchasing practices and therefore reduce climate change, how that money revenue can be used to offset the costs to people for under universal meals or WIC or et cetera. And then you create that record because you know it's probable that it's going to be litigated. And so you plan for that, and you plan for Monsanto to have their attorneys call you every other day saying we're going to sue you.
Yay.
Because that's going to happen. You're just prepared for that.
So this is a question that might be for John, but
Sorry. It breaks every once in a while.
the amount of the tax, and I know you said the dollar figure is a placeholder, you also need a unit to apply it to, presumably. And so I wasn't sure in the case of milk, for example, was it going to be applied to a gallon of milk or some other volume of milk or to a truckload?
It's applied to the product. So it's really about the transit of the product. So since it's on per mile traveled, it doesn't really matter if the product is sold in ounces or pounds or whatever unit. It's applied to the miles of transit.
So if I went to the store and bought that half gallon of milk and milk had traveled from?
It's probably from Lehigh Valley, Allentown area. That is about 350, 400 miles, depending on where it's sold in Vermont. It would have 35 cents added to it.
That would be 35 cents per container, regardless of.
That's one thing you probably need to talk about, whether it's going to be assessed against the individual product in transit or in the wholesale load. And I didn't address that because it depends on where you assess the taxation. But it's easy enough to do either, because when these products are sold, there's where it's going to be hard is it's going to be the loose produce. And so you can't necessarily, you're going to have to do that in some way. I don't know, per pound maybe, but that's the hardest, I think. You got a prepackaged strawberries, prepackaged blueberries. That's not a problem. Your loose onions, I start to get a little bit, got to figure that one out.
I think to that, maybe so if a bulk truck, if a truck from Pennsylvania comes with with 50,000 pounds of milk in a tractor trailer truck, and that is assessed and taxed, and a box trailer comes with 1 pallet of gallons of milk, is that the same cost? And so the price of the individual gallons of milk would be exorbitantly higher than the individual gallons within the 50,000 gallon trailer.
So it's where the product is packaged for retail sale. Between where it's packaged for retail sale to the point of where it is sold or intended for retail sale.
So if a truck comes with one pallet of red that was packaged for sale in Pennsylvania,
Right.
comes from Vermont, and a tractor trailer comes with 60 pallets.
Right. So that's the question. Do you assess against the pallet or do you assess against each prepackaged unit within that? And you probably go to that question of equitable apportionment under state law, how you would equitably apportion. You probably, I would think, do it per unit in the load.
Right.
And then that's equitably apportioned. But that's a question for you all. It's a policy question, talking through with Abby on how to do that best.
John?
There's no limitation if we say charge the Department of Taxes or the Agency of Ag with coming up with, say, the first list of what would be taxed. I mean, you don't have to have Cheez-Its involved, or you could say, like, onions, we just can't figure this out, so let's leave onions alone. I mean, you have to be equitable across, like, all produce.
There's court precedent that says that as long as the government meets all its constitutional barriers, government can regulate incrementally. So it can stand up a program just for these people versus those people. And as long as it's still constitutional, it's not discriminatory, it's equitably apportioned, you have a reason why it's not going to be apportioned against this unit versus that unit, you can regulate incrementally. And you do it all the time. You probably just don't realize it.
Has anybody ever done, I'm just thinking about it like from a sustainability aspect, has there ever been a approach to tax on sustainability? I'm thinking parallels to sore subject, but the clean heat standard, like saying that we're gonna tax on a product that's in theory detrimental to the environment because it has to travel a further amount of distance, and use that money to incentivize a product that's better for the environment because it's grown locally. Do you see where I'm going with that?
I do, but when you start saying we're going to tax this thing and it came from away to benefit this thing that's from here, that's like ding, ding, ding. That's discrimination and economic protectionism. You gotta stay away from like framing the issue that way. You have to frame the issue as about things like encouraging consumers to spend less on products that have a greater carbon impact.
Yeah.
Right? That's not necessarily discriminatory or economic protection. You wanna incentivize high nutrition foods, or again, not protectionist. So there's things that you would have to discuss and formulate. But I think it's possible. I'm not. It's one of those things where it's like, if you asked me to handicap it, I couldn't tell you if I can handicap it because I don't even know the horses that are in the race yet, and then I got to figure out what track it's going to be on and if it's raining and all that kind of thing, and I don't know, but I think your horse can win if you align the conditions appropriately. So that's kind of my metaphor. If things aren't done the right way, there's possibility that litigation could be successful, but if you do it the right way, I think you could be successful at this.
And you're talking about surviving a legal challenge.
Yes.
Okay. John?
So matching it up, like strawberries, Vermont strawberries to California strawberries, like just commodities we grow here, does that get us into equity hot water? If
it's just on commodities here, if it's just intrastate commodities, you don't have the Commerce Clause issue at all.
No, I'm saying if say we had a list of 12 things, milk, strawberries, carrots, because they grow here and we want to incentivize local, does that get us into trouble?
That's economic protectionism.
So we can't say it's for this reason.
So your thought, John, was that the products covered in this bill would be limited to products that we do produce here?
Right, that's like the milk one. I mean, it was to incentivize local farmers, which
Right.
might do.
But that's not how it's defined. The way that it's defined, when you go through the bill, it's a tax on the mileage and agricultural commodity travels before retail sale. And an agricultural commodity, it says would be defined, so there's opportunity for you to change how it's defined, and I did that intentionally. So you're not tied down to a definition and a statement of purpose. Would be defined to include horticultural crops, fruits, vegetables, poultry and meat, processed for consumption, maple syrup, honey, milk, cheese, yogurt, and other dairy products. So it's not gonna be on, just, I don't know, Honeycrisp apples, because they're grown here. It's gonna be on all apples. It's gonna be on bananas, even though there are no bananas sold.
But we could
No bananas.
generally say bananas are not part of the list now. We're starting with.
You can define the universe of what you want the tax to apply to, but you have to do it in a way that avoids the constitutional issue.
And are you saying there might be a constitutional issue if the list in fact only included things that you might find growing in Vermont? Or
No, I don't think that would raise a constitutional issue. I don't. But one of the issues with short forms is you're not really dealing with the actual language in front of you. You kind of have to suppose. And so my supposition is I don't think that would be a constitutional issue, but I have to reserve a final conclusion based on any language that's drafted.
who else had a hand?
Quick, it just, this, where I live, I don't have any chain supermarkets. I only have independent supermarkets, and they're gonna hate this. Cause it's gonna make all their food that they sell cost more, and they're gonna have to pass those costs on. And I don't mean to bash John on this one, cause I think it's actually it's a very interesting thought. And I wonder if, just like now, all food is labeled with calories, if there were some way we could say, this food traveled so many miles to get to the Vermont border. And just to get people to think about, oh, that's really far. And, just like that milk's from Minnesota, one milk's from Pennsylvania. And if we could start thinking about where our food comes from without getting taxed first, I don't know. I don't even know how we do that, but I feel like it's a really interesting concept. I don't want people to have to pay more for food.
So you run into FDA issues there because the FDA already requires food to be labeled in some way from where it is from or the headquarters of the company that produced it. So when you go to Trader Joe's and you buy Trader Joe's sliced bananas, you know those bananas weren't grown in like Monrovia, California, which is where Trader Joe's is, right?
Right.
But that's where they're headquartered.
Oh, I see.
And so they get to label their product that way. And the FDA has a preemption clause that says if they've adopted something regarding the labeling of food, states can adopt their own requirements, but they have to be consistent with the FDA's requirements.
Got it. Okay.
So that's where you run into,
Right.
You can't go at it the labeling way because FDA's already got that requirement for labeling either where it's from or the headquarters of the business that produces.
Well, plus we'd be such a specific label for Vermont that it wouldn't, they wouldn't Didn't we just do, anyways?
We did that for GMO. We were.
Right, yeah, right, and
we're
Cheerios had to
gonna
redo their
we're-
boxes.
We're gonna have our own
Right.
label, we're gonna have our own, and it never, the court never actually had to hold anything because it was so clear that that the food producers were gonna lose. And she basically said, you're gonna lose. And so they went to Congress. And they got Congress to adopt a requirement that FDA adopt a GMO labeling rule that preempted all the states.
Okay.
So that's where that wound up. But they were gonna lose. We were gonna win on that one. That was like, we were pretty happy when Judge Rice, she came out with her statement. She said that I screwed something up, which I did, but it was like really minor in context of the whole. And it was like one of those things where as soon as she said what she said, I was like, oh, shit. All right. I was like, I just knew I should have done something. I knew I messed up there.
So that's at the circuit court level?
That was a district court level. I mean, but it was so clear at that point that that committee, this committee had done so much good work and had such a record that it was just pretty much clear that there wasn't going to survive. The challenge wasn't going to survive.
Okay, well, this has been an interesting discussion and introduction to the bill. Thank you, John, for bringing it to us. Any other questions for Mike?
So do short forms turn into committee bills then?
Yes.
Okay.
That's the process. You actually have to vote to take the short form up to turn it into a committee bill, not like vote on the content of the committee bill. You have to just vote to take it up to turn it into a committee bill.
And then you would potentially
And then-
a long form version.
Right, and then you direct me at what you want drafted, and I draft that as a committee bill, and then it's like any other committee bill. You are past the crossover deadline. I don't know how the House is dealing with that. The Senate actually has a temporary rule that says anything that's introduced after the crossover deadline has to go into the Rules Committee. I don't think the House has a specific rule on that, but you would want to talk to your leadership or Betsy Ann about what would happen if a committee bill came out at this point. Probably it would go to Rules.
Good, all right, thank you.
You ever got a short form?
I haven't, no, other than the short form bills that we've had conversations about, the trails bills. But I haven't. Any other thoughts on, before we leave the bill? Rodney?
John should go and figure it all out.
I think he started by suggesting that might be the direction he was thinking of going.
I was gonna say, I think it's an interesting idea. I crunched some numbers. If we included all food in this, including processed food, with your 0.001 amount, if we applied that universally to everything, and everything on average came to Vermont at a distance of 1,000 miles, we'd be doubling our food costs, basically. I mean, essentially, we spend about $2 billion a year in Vermont on food, and $2 billion, and we would be bringing in another $2 billion. I mean, clearly, that's probably more than what you're shooting for here. But I mean, it shows how powerful this could be if we were to use it in a positive way. I think that's the real thing there, isn't it? How do we do it where it's not a negative effect, but a positive one?
The other, I forgot to mention this, the original, people are going to say food isn't taxed. And that's not really true. Most food isn't taxed, but some food is. And so that'll probably be one of the first arguments that you'll hear, food isn't taxed. But that's not necessarily true.
What food's taxed?
Alcohol,
Unless it has flour in it.
so.
Is that food?
They are, man.
Soft drinks.
It's prepared food.
Prepared food.
Yeah, restaurant food, yeah.
So you just be prepared for that argument.
I mean, to the extent that it's not taxed, to the extent that it isn't taxed, it's only because the legislature has
Right,
has a tax on it.
right. And that might be another reason to have it as a wholesale excise tax versus a sales tax, because there's a uniform streamlined sales tax among the states. And if you deviate from that, it has consequences. You have to talk to Abby about all of that. But having it as an excise tax versus a retail sales tax probably has some benefits as well.
All right.
Any other final thoughts? What would next steps be?
So, I think as a committee, a couple possible directions. We as a committee now have walkthroughs of several bills, and we're planning to take some more testimony on some of those other bills this week even. And so the committee can weigh in. We won't do necessarily, I'm not asking you to do that now, but weigh in on you think that there's other people you'd like to get testimony from. And John, if you have thoughts, we could do that. And then I think after we've had additional testimony on these various bills, we can pause and say, what do we want to do? And do we want to vote to take it down and have the Ledge Council work on some language? And I think it would take a commitment on the part of a certain number of committee members to actually say, okay, I'm willing to take this on. Normally when we get a bill, somebody else has already done the heavy lifting and put at least the first set of words together. We don't have that here. So you might say, okay, I feel I'm in a good enough place now that I want to do it. And then all it takes is getting 6 of us to vote to, majority of the committee to take it down. Okay. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike.
Bye.
Thank you, Mike.